Very much, Acting Deputy President, and I rise to give a report on the Senate inquiry conducted by the Economic References Committee into retirement outcomes and particularly into the interim report into existing and proposed superannuation for housing policies. And the reason we commissioned this particular report and this inquiry is because we are looking at all the options to try and solve the nation's housing crisis. We don't have a closed mind. We're not against any particular solution because we are not in the business of closing our minds to certain ideas. I believe that the nation is much the poorer for a policy debate where political parties cannot— Sorry, what was that? So were you referring to me?
Senator Bragg, you are required to address your comments through the chair.
Okay, sorry, I thought I heard something. And so the point I was trying to make here is that it is very regrettable when a political party is not able to consider a reasonable solution because it is bound to vested interests, because it is beholden to vested interests, I should say. So I don't think the parliament needs a lecture from anyone as to the importance of housing for younger people. If you look at any survey of people under the age of 40, they will nominate housing as a major issue. And that does not discriminate between whether you are a renter, whether you are a holder of a mortgage, or you are a prospective buyer. It doesn't matter what your status is. It is a huge issue. And so that is why we thought it was important to look at the superannuation issues here. Now, the government has had almost 2 years in office. It identified housing as a problem when it came in. It has cooked up a housing target of 1.2 million houses, which no one believes that they will meet. The Premier of New South Wales, Mr Minns, has laughed at these targets and says that New South Wales will never comply with these targets. Furthermore, the solution that Labor rolled out of their campaign launch at the last federal election was known to us all as Help to Buy, a federal Help to Buy scheme. Now, this is a scheme that would provide 10,000 houses. So if you're admitting that you need to provide 1.2 million, 10,000 houses is barely going to touch the sides. And of course, the problem with Help to Buy is that it is part of a broader theme that Labor has deployed on housing, and that is that it's given up on individual home ownership. And Labor has adopted in this term a policy of corporate home ownership, that their solution to the housing crisis is to call in their mates, the super funds, call in their mates, the foreign fund managers, and say to them, well, we'll give you a tax cut or a tax subsidy to build the houses of tomorrow. Of course, the catch here is that not only will these major institutions own the houses, in most cases these will be build-to-rent houses. So it is locking in a model of housing which many Australians do not want. Many Australians are comfortable renting, but most Australians do not want to rent. And so this corporate housing policy, where the big super funds and the foreign fund managers are given tax subsidies and taxpayer handouts to build or to construct build-to-rent houses, is the first element where Labor gives up on home ownership. The second element is this Help to Buy scheme, drawing on a flawed state-based scheme which very few people want to use, of shared equity. The government has put forward, finally, legislation to create a Commonwealth Help to Buy scheme. And I thank the Greens for their wisdom in joining with us to oppose this bad legislation, which would only be a very small number of houses when we are facing a massive crisis. So everyone knows that the major issue here is going to be about supply. How do we build more houses? How do we make sure that the children of Australia can look to a future where they can live in a house that they can own themselves? Now, to build those houses, you need to find a way to work constructively, collaboratively perhaps, or maybe you need to be using coercive measures on local governments and the states. Mr Albanese's attempt to pay the states to build houses has been a failure. It has been one of the greatest failures of this government, because even though he's offering to pay premiers to build houses, when you have wall-to-wall Labor governments, they still won't build the houses. In fact, you have seen construction figures go backwards under this government. We're building fewer houses than we built just 3 or 4 years ago, but this is all happening while we're opening the floodgates to more migrants than we've seen on a per capita basis since the 1950s. So you have a fundamentally broken housing policy here from the government. So we accept that you have to build more houses, you have to focus on that supply piece, and that is something that we will continue to look at. But there is also a very strong case to tilt the scales in favour of first home buyers. And this is where I think my great disappointment comes in, that what is the reason why the government, or any party for that matter, would not look to allow people to use their own money to get into the first home market, to get their first home? I can't think of any reason other than a party or an organisation is beholden to commercial or vested interests. And this is why the inquiry we conducted into using super and looking at ways to enhance proposed and existing policies that are on the books is so important. And so the committee process was quite simply one which looked at the deposit side. We looked at how you could help Australians use their own money to get a deposit together. So for a millennial, an older millennial, close to 40, you're looking at average super balances of around $80,000 to $90,000. Now, in most cities in Australia, that would get you a large part of the way towards a deposit. So that is why we already have a policy which allows Australians to take $50,000 of their own superannuation to help get a deposit together. Because, of course, we recognise that the key determinant of your success in retirement, financial success that is not your superannuation balance. It is your home ownership status. So we are very comfortable with the starting point that we announced a couple of years ago, that $50,000 of your super can be used for a first home. But what we found during the inquiry is that that would not be sufficient for a number of Australians, particularly those older millennials that do have higher balances. And so we have recommended in this report that the threshold be lifted from 50 to 100 or 150, or have no maximum withdrawal cap. So we've given some options there. The second recommendation we made, which is material, is one where at the moment the current policy works like this. You have to put the money back into super if you sell it the first home. But for a lot of people, their first home is getting them onto the ladder. It might be a small flat, and so if they want to buy a bigger house for their family and they sell their first house, they should be able to transfer that money into that second house. The idea of putting it back into the lockbox of the super funds might well suit the vested interests of the financial sector and the trade unions, but it's not going to be in the best interests of these families who are wanting to house their children or house themselves. So those are the two principal recommendations. We also looked to recommend models where, for people that have great anxiety about any money leaving the preservation of superannuation, that there are ways that perhaps APRA could provide some guidance to schemes that are wanting to use money as debt or collateral that is remaining inside the scheme. And so I think we've proven that you can deliver a parliamentary report which gives you a range of options, and I think that's what the Australian people are looking for. They're looking for all of the options to be deployed. I think people understand, despite sensitivities in certain parts of our bigger cities, that we do need to see more density, we do need to see more supply, but equally we want to see the playing field tilted in favour of first home buyers. And that's why it's critical that we look at the cost of construction, the cost of lending, and, of course, allowing people to use their own money. If people have their own money that belongs to them and they want to use it for a first home, there is no reason they should not be able to do that, because, as I say, the key determinant of your success in retirement is not your superannuation balance, It is your home ownership status.